Story 1. When I first moved into my new apartment, I told myself it was the fresh start I needed. The building was old, tucked away on the edge of town, and the rent was cheap, too cheap, maybe, but I didn't want to think about that. The apartment itself was small, cozy, and full of charm. The creaky wooden floors and thin walls made it far from perfect, but it felt like mine, and I was determined to make it work. For the first few days, it was quiet. Too quiet, actually. No strange noises, no flickering lights, just the sound of my own footsteps as I unpacked boxes and arranged furniture. I even cooked my first meal in the tiny kitchen. Everything was peaceful, yet, deep down, I couldn't shake an odd feeling. A subtle unease. Like the space was holding its breath. It wasn't until the fourth day that I found it. I had been cleaning the floorboards in the living room when my mop struck something hard. At first, I thought it was just a nail or a piece of debris, but the sound wasn't right. It was hollow, almost as if something was hidden beneath the floor. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pried up one of the loose floorboards. Beneath it, in a small, dusty compartment, I found a single folded piece of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, and fragile, like it had been hidden there for decades. My hands shook a little as I carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. The note read, "I don't trust anyone in this building. They are watching you." My heart stopped. I read it again, hoping it would make more sense the second time. It didn't. Who wrote this? And why? My first instinct was to dismiss it, some prank or a relic from a paranoid previous tenant. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why go through the trouble of hiding it under the floor? That night, the words from the note haunted me, "They are watching you." I told myself to forget it. I shoved the note back into the compartment, replaced the floorboard, and tried to move on. But from that moment, the apartment felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the creaks of the building louder. Later that evening, as I sat on the couch, I heard it for the first time, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps above me. I hadn't met my upstairs neighbor yet, but I figured they were just moving around, until I realized how deliberate the sound was. Back and forth. Back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking right above me. My breath hitched. I got up and peered out the window at the building above mine. Nothing. Just dark windows staring back at me. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went upstairs and knocked on the door of the unit above me. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't alone. A faint scratching sound joined them. It came from the walls, soft at first, but growing louder. It sounded like something, or someone, was clawing through the plaster. Panic set in. I rushed back to the living room and pulled up the floorboard again, retrieving the note. I read it over and over, searching for some hidden meaning, but it offered no answers. Was it a warning? A cruel joke? The next morning, I went to the landlord. He was an older man, gruff and uninterested. When I mentioned the note and the noises, his face hardened. He muttered something about the building's age and how previous tenants had left suddenly, but he didn't elaborate. The days that followed were unbearable. The footsteps didn't stop. They weren't just above me anymore, they came from the walls, the floor, even the hallway outside my door. At night, I heard whispers. Faint, unintelligible voices, just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings make noises, right? But deep down, I knew this was different. I wasn't alone in that apartment. Something was there. Something watching, waiting. Every night, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The air in the apartment felt heavier, suffocating. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if the apartment itself was alive with something malevolent. All I knew was that I wasn't safe. I wasn't alone. Story 2. When I moved into the small, quiet neighborhood, it felt like salvation. After years of enduring the chaos and clamor of the city, this place seemed like an escape, a sanctuary. The tree-lined streets whispered of peace, the old houses exuded character, and the silence promised stability. I unpacked my boxes with eager hands, breathing in the hope that this new chapter would finally bring me the calm I had been craving. The first letter arrived about a week after I'd settled in. It was folded neatly, tucked into my mailbox, and sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp. The handwriting was elegant and fluid, the ink slightly smudged, as though written in haste. At first, I thought it might be a warm note from a neighbor welcoming me to the area. But as I unfolded it, a chill rippled through me. The message was brief and unsettling. I see you. I know what you did. I read it twice, my heart pounding louder each time. There was no signature, no hint of who might have written it. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, a harmless, if not poorly timed, joke from someone in the neighborhood. But there was something about the words that felt too precise, too intimate, as if the writer knew me in a way they shouldn't. The second letter came 2 days later. The paper was heavier this time, and the handwriting slower, more deliberate. It read, "I've seen you at night. I know where you go. And I know what you think of when you're alone." I froze. The words felt like a blade pressed against my spine. How could anyone know such things? I had barely ventured out at night since moving here, just a few late walks or quick trips to the store. And as for my thoughts, they were mine alone, locked away where no one could reach them. Or so I had believed. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, I couldn't shake the growing unease. Each new letter chipped away at my sense of safety. Every few days, another one appeared, each more invasive than the last. The third letter made my blood run cold. "I know what you did last summer," it began. "The things you think you've left behind are still with you. I will remind you of them." What could they mean? I hadn't done anything wrong, nothing that anyone could possibly hold against me. Yet the letter felt like a hand reaching from my past, dragging its shadows into my new life. I started double-checking the locks, drawing the curtains tighter at night. But no matter how careful I was, the letters kept coming. In one, the writer described the exact way I had left a chair angled in my living room. Another detailed a conversation I'd had with a friend over coffee, words spoken softly, behind closed doors. Someone was watching me. Someone was paying attention to the smallest details of my life. Paranoia crept into every corner of my mind. I couldn't step outside without glancing over my shoulder. The rustling of leaves became whispers, the creak of floorboards a warning. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every shadow seemed to shift, every silence felt like it was holding its breath. Then, one evening, I came home to find a letter waiting on my doorstep. This one was different. The handwriting was my own. "I know you're scared," it began. "You don't have to pretend anymore. You've been hiding from yourself, but I know the truth. You can't outrun your past. You can't escape who you really are." My hands trembled as I read the words. My own handwriting stared back at me, mocking me. But I hadn't written it. I couldn't have. Could I? Panic clawed at my chest as I tried to make sense of it. Had I done this to myself? Had I been so consumed by isolation and fear that I'd written these letters without remembering? The thought was almost more horrifying than the idea of someone else doing it. Desperate for answers, I turned to my neighbors. I asked if anyone had seen anything strange or unusual. But their smiles were polite, their words kind yet empty. No one knew anything. To them, the town was still as serene and unassuming as ever. And then came the final letter. It was a single line, scrawled hastily across the page. "I'm closer than you think." At that moment, I realized the horror wasn't just in the letters, it was in the silence that followed. Story 3. The night shift in a hospital is a strange, liminal time, a space caught between the chaos of the day and the eerie stillness of early morning. As a night shift nurse, I was used to this peculiar atmosphere. My hours were filled with routine, monitoring patients, administering medication, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly in the silence. Yet, no matter how accustomed I was, there was always an unease that lingered, like a shadow just beyond my reach. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something wasn't right with Mr. Harris. He was one of my regulars, a frail man in his late 80s, worn down by chronic illnesses that had tethered him to our care for months. I'd grown used to his quiet demeanor and fragile presence. But tonight, he seemed too still. His skin, normally pale, had taken on a ghostly, almost waxen quality. I approached his bed, a creeping dread settling in my chest. His chest was motionless. The rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor, an ever-present reassurance, was absent. I told myself it was the equipment. Maybe a loose lead or a malfunction. I adjusted the settings, rechecked the connections, even tapped the side of the machine in desperation. But nothing changed. That's when the realization hit me. I leaned closer, my hand trembling as I touched his wrist. Cold. His eyes, half open, stared blankly past me. He didn't look like someone who had just passed away, he looked like someone who had been gone for a long time. Panic gripped me as I turned to his chart at the foot of the bed. It said he'd been admitted days ago for a respiratory infection. Stable condition. No red flags, no notes, nothing to suggest he'd died. My mind raced. How could this have happened? How could no one have noticed? I pressed the call button, but when I picked up the phone, I was met with static. A garbled, distant voice crackled through the line, as if speaking to me from the depths of a tunnel. "Everything all right?" the voice asked. I hesitated. How could I explain what I was standing in front of, a lifeless body no one seemed to realize was dead? "I need you to come to room 214, I said, my voice shaking. Something's not right." There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches too long, tightening the air around you. Finally, the charge nurse responded, her tone sharper now. "What's going on?" I tried to explain, but the words felt clumsy, surreal. A part of me hoped she'd tell me it was all some oversight, a mistake that could easily be rectified. "I'll be right there," she said. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I stood next to Mr. Harris's bed, unable to shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred and wrong. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, stretching toward me like grasping hands. My thoughts spiraled. Had he died hours ago? Days? Why hadn't anyone noticed? When the charge nurse finally arrived, her expression was unreadable as she approached the bed. She checked his wrist, her fingers pressing gently against his cold skin. Her face betrayed nothing, but the sigh that escaped her lips spoke volumes. "You're right," she said softly. "He's been gone, for days." The weight of her words fell between us like a stone, heavy and suffocating. Days. He had been lying there, lifeless, while the hospital moved on around him as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was unbearable. Neither of us spoke, the enormity of the failure hanging thick in the air. It didn't make sense. How could something like this happen in a hospital, a place built to save lives? The charge nurse left to notify the attending physician and administration. I stayed behind, alone with Mr. Harris. The hum of the fluorescent lights above felt deafening. My mind churned with questions I couldn't answer. Was this negligence? A symptom of understaffing? Or something worse, a systemic failure that allowed a man to slip away unnoticed? When they finally took his body away, it felt like an afterthought. A new set of protocols was introduced, promises made to ensure it wouldn't happen again. But none of it erased the image of Mr. Harris's lifeless body or the creeping horror of realizing how long he had been there, forgotten. Even now, the questions haunt me. How many others have been overlooked? How many patients had died in silence, their passing unnoticed, their existence unacknowledged? Some nights, when I'm alone in the quiet hours of my shift, I swear I feel it, the weight of those unanswered questions, the ghosts of those we failed. And every time I pass room 214, I feel a chill, as if Mr. Harris is still there, waiting for someone to notice him. Story 4. It was early afternoon when I began my solo hike, the forest welcoming me with a cool breeze that whispered through the trees. This trip had been planned for months, a chance to escape, to reconnect with nature, and to find some clarity away from the noise of daily life. The trail was familiar, winding and well-trodden, but something about today felt different. The air carried a strange energy, like a silent hum I could sense but not hear. As I walked, sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. It was peaceful, yet a faint unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The path led me deeper into the woods, through thick underbrush and soft, springy earth beneath my boots. I had taken this trail before, but today it felt altered. My steps were steady, but a quiet voice in the back of my mind urged me forward, as though there was somewhere I was meant to be. About an hour in, I stumbled upon a small clearing nestled between two hills. It was a place I didn't recognize, hidden away from the main trail. The trees formed a natural ring around it, their branches arching protectively overhead. The ground was blanketed in moss, and a gentle stream bubbled nearby, its sound both soothing and eerie in the unnatural silence. I paused, torn between curiosity and caution. Something about the clearing felt inviting, like it had been waiting for me. Unable to resist, I stepped inside and began to explore. Toward the center of the clearing, a tree stood out from the rest. It was massive and ancient, its thick, gnarled roots stretching out like skeletal fingers across the ground. The bark shimmered faintly in the dappled light, as though it was alive with its own pulse. Drawn to it, I moved closer, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the trunk was my name. My full name. I froze. The letters were unmistakable, etched deeply into the bark in handwriting I recognized as my own. My pulse quickened. There was no way this could be real. I had never been to this part of the forest before. I certainly hadn't carved my name into any tree here. The carving was old, weathered by years of exposure, yet still distinct. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the rough bark. A chill shot through me, as if the tree itself was exhaling, its cold breath seeping into my skin. I stepped back, my mind racing for answers that refused to come. How was this possible? Had someone else been here? If so, how could they have known my name, my handwriting? The thought made my stomach churn. I searched the clearing for clues, for any sign of another person. There was nothing. No footprints. No abandoned campsite. No evidence that anyone had been here for years. The air in the clearing felt heavier now, oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, a trick of my mind. But then, the sound of rustling broke the silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from every direction and none at all. My chest tightened as I spun around, my eyes darting through the dense trees. There was nothing to see, no movement, no figures in the shadows. The rustling continued, though, like whispers just out of reach. My hand instinctively went to the knife in my pack. For a moment, I stood paralyzed, unsure if I was supposed to flee or stay. The forest seemed alive, its energy buzzing around me. Finally, the rustling stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its place. Desperate to shake the unease, I set up camp near the stream. As night fell, the forest sounds returned, a chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures, but it felt off, like they were performing for an unseen audience. I built a fire, its crackling flames offering little comfort against the encroaching darkness. I couldn't stop staring at the tree, its carving burned into my mind. Sleep came reluctantly and offered no solace. I woke several times, jolted by the feeling of being watched. Each time I looked around, the shadows danced, but nothing was there. Still, the oppressive presence lingered, just beyond the edge of the firelight. By dawn, I had had enough. The forest felt wrong, like it had shifted overnight, and I was desperate to leave. I packed quickly, casting one last glance at the tree before heading back to the main trail. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had taken something from me, or perhaps given something I didn't yet understand. The clearing, the tree, my name etched in bark, they were more than a coincidence. They were a message, a warning, or maybe an invitation. I'll never forget that place, or the way it made me feel as though the forest itself had eyes and had been watching me long before I ever arrived. Story 5. I had spent the afternoon running errands and catching up with friends, and by the time I returned to my apartment, the day was slipping into evening. The door creaked softly as I turned the key and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of my home. Dim light filtered through the windows, stretching long, distorted shadows across the floor. At first, everything seemed normal. I set my keys down on the counter and kicked off my shoes, but then, something. A feeling. A subtle wrongness I couldn't place. I paused, my eyes scanning the living room. That's when I noticed it. The furniture. It was all rearranged. The sofa, which had always sat snugly against the far wall, now jutted awkwardly into the middle of the room. The coffee table had been moved to the window, its usual neat placement abandoned. Chairs that should have been aligned around the dining table were scattered like they'd been tossed carelessly. I froze. My brain raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I done this? No. I would have remembered moving my entire living room around. This wasn't me. A creeping unease slithered up my spine as I moved further into the room, carefully stepping around the oddly placed furniture. My first thought was that someone had been here, but there were no signs of a break-in. The locks were secure. The windows untouched. Nothing else seemed out of place, except for the living room itself, a silent, twisted puzzle left for me to solve. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a prank. But who? No one else had a key to my apartment. And even if they did, why would they do this? I wandered into the kitchen, hoping for something, anything, that would offer a logical explanation. Everything there was exactly as I'd left it. My phone sat on the counter, undisturbed. The coffee mug I'd used that morning was still in its spot by the sink. Normal. But the unease wouldn't leave. I returned to the living room and examined it more closely. Little details began to stand out, making the whole thing even more unsettling. The cushions on the sofa were slightly out of place, as if someone had been sitting there recently. The lamp on the end table was twisted at an odd angle, its shade tilted unnaturally. It wasn't just the furniture, it was the feeling that someone had been here. I sank to the floor, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I'd come home tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Then, a sound. A thud. It came from the direction of my bedroom. Every muscle in my body tensed as the sound echoed faintly down the hall. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see. But I couldn't ignore it. Moving cautiously, I crept down the hallway, each step slow and deliberate, my breath caught in my throat. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, just as I had left it that morning. For a long moment, I hesitated, staring at the sliver of darkness beyond the doorframe. Finally, I pushed it open. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was made. The curtains were drawn. Everything was exactly as it should have been. But then, on the bedside table, I saw it. A small object. An old family heirloom. It had been moved. I knew for certain I hadn't touched it in weeks. It was one of those things that just stayed where it belonged, a piece of the background. But now, it sat slightly off-center, its placement wrong. My stomach churned. Someone had been in here. Someone had touched my things. I backed out of the room, the walls of my apartment suddenly feeling too close, too confining. I checked the locks on the windows and doors again, my hands trembling. All were secure. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Someone had been here. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, my voice unsteady as I explained what I'd found. They listened quietly, then said what I was already thinking: you should call the police. But I hesitated. There was no broken glass, no forced entry, no obvious proof. Just a rearranged living room and a trinket slightly out of place. Would they even believe me? After a long pause, my friend spoke again. You said you live alone, right? No one else has a key. I nodded, though they couldn't see me. Maybe you should check again. Carefully. The call ended, and I stood there in silence, the weight of their words pressing down on me. I turned back to the living room, determined to look closer this time. Slowly, methodically, I scanned every corner, every detail, my eyes searching for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. Near the edge of the couch, half hidden under the fabric, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. My hands shook as I bent down and picked it up. Unfolding it slowly, I saw a single, handwritten message scrawled across the page. I see you. The room seemed to close in around me. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating. A chill ran down my spine, so sharp it felt like ice. And then, in the oppressive silence, I realized I wasn't alone. Story 6. When Claire asked me to house sit for her while she and her family went on a 2-week vacation, I jumped at the opportunity. It felt like the perfect chance to get away from my tiny apartment, and I looked forward to the peace and quiet of her beautiful home. Claire was meticulous, the kind of person who kept everything in perfect order, and I expected the experience to be relaxing, maybe even dull. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The house was exactly as I remembered it: polished hardwood floors, fresh flowers arranged in a vase on the entryway table, and sunlight streaming softly through the windows. Everything was neat, organized, and welcoming. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A weight in the air, subtle yet suffocating. It wasn't the house itself, I'd been here countless times before. It was a feeling, a quiet, nagging sensation at the back of my mind, as if someone, or something, was watching me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, Claire's home was bigger than mine, quieter too. I wandered through the kitchen, the living room, and the dining area, trying to shake the unease, but each room felt strangely unfamiliar despite how well I knew them. The silence was the worst part. Without Claire's presence, her chatter, her kids running around, it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're not really alone. As I made my way down the hallway toward the back of the house, my eyes landed on a door I had never really noticed before. It was smaller than the others, tucked away between the laundry room and the guest bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw it then, the thick, rusted lock on the handle. I froze. It seemed odd, out of place, even. Claire had never mentioned a locked door, and I couldn't remember ever seeing it open. My curiosity flickered to life. What was behind it? A storage closet? A utility space? The longer I stared at the door, the stranger it seemed. Something about it gnawed at me. I hesitated for a moment, then tried the handle, though I already knew it wouldn't budge. The lock held firm, its rusted surface cool and unyielding beneath my fingers. I lingered there, staring at the door as though it might offer me answers. Instead, it gave me something else, the distinct, gut-wrenching feeling that whatever was behind it, was watching me too. I shook off the thought, forcing myself to step away. This wasn't my house, and I had no business poking around. I busied myself with unpacking and checking that the windows and doors were secure. Still, that door lingered in my mind, like a splinter I couldn't ignore. As night fell, the house seemed to change. The once inviting silence deepened into something oppressive, and the shadows stretched longer. That feeling of being watched crept back, sharper this time, more insistent. Even as I tried to distract myself with a movie, my eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, and the door. By the time the credits rolled, I couldn't take it anymore. Against my better judgment, I found myself standing in front of it once again. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I ran my fingers over the lock. It looked old but sturdy, the kind of thing meant to keep people, or things, out. Or in. I told myself it was ridiculous. Claire had probably locked up some old junk and forgotten about it. But the longer I stood there, the stronger the pull became. I had to know. I went to the kitchen, rummaging through a drawer until I found a set of small tools. I wasn't exactly a lock-picking expert, but it was a simple mechanism. My hands trembled as I worked, each soft click of the tools echoing louder than it should in the quiet house. Then, with a soft, almost reluctant click, the lock gave way. I almost didn't want to open the door. But I did. The air inside was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. The room was small and bare, but what caught my eye were the walls. Symbols, faded and crude, were carved into the wood. Some were barely visible, their lines worn with time, while others stood out sharply, fresh and jagged. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, the weight of the space. The markings seemed to hum faintly, as though they were alive, vibrating with an energy I couldn't see but could feel. Scattered across the floor were objects, old photographs, yellowed and brittle, a dusty leather-bound journal, and a small wooden box. My breath caught as I reached for the journal. The pages crumbled slightly at the edges as I flipped through them, the handwriting jagged and frantic. The words I could make out made my stomach churn, references to binding, containment, and warnings. I stared at the box, my instincts screaming at me to leave it alone. But my hands moved on their own, lifting the lid. Inside was a small, discolored object wrapped in cloth. As I unwrapped it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The object, a doll, crudely made, its face a twisted, hollowed-out grin, felt wrong in my hands. The house groaned. The sound was faint at first, but then it grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the walls. The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, their jagged lines twisting as though they were alive. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Whatever had been locked away in this room, I realized with dawning horror, had been kept here for a reason. And now, it was free. Story 7. I never thought I'd end up as a private investigator. The job always seemed too risky, too unpredictable for someone like me. But after I lost my job at the insurance agency, I didn't have much choice. Bills had to be paid, and a former colleague had recommended the position. The idea of solving mysteries, uncovering hidden truths, it pulled at something inside me I didn't even know was there. It wasn't glamorous, but it was work, and at that point, that was all I needed. The first few weeks were dull, uneventful. Most of the cases were the same: missing pets, suspicious spouses, a few thefts. Nothing that would make me lose sleep. My office was small and cramped, barely big enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and the space for my thoughts to bounce around. I spent my days sifting through old files, tailing people for a few days, hoping to catch something off. It wasn't exciting, but it paid. That was all that mattered. Then came the phone call. A woman's voice, shaking with urgency, asked if I could take on a personal case. She didn't give her name, only said she had a problem she needed solved. There was a desperation in her voice, something that made me say yes without thinking. I met her at a small cafe. She looked so ordinary. Brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a simple gray sweater. She could have been anyone. But the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, eyes darting nervously, something wasn't right. She handed me a thick manila envelope and asked me to read its contents. Inside were photos. Dozens of them. All of a man. Some were taken in public places, others through windows, from a distance. The man was always in the frame, but he never seemed to notice the camera. As I flipped through the pictures, a cold, unsettling feeling crawled into my stomach. These weren't random shots. They were taken with purpose, meticulously focusing on the same person over and over. I froze. It didn't take long to recognize him. It was me. My hands went clammy, and I dropped the photos onto the table. My heart pounded in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice harsh, more panicked than I meant it to sound. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide, waiting for me to say something, anything. But I couldn't process it. The photos, they weren't just of her. They were of me. In the background of a park, walking into a grocery store, sitting at a coffee shop. Some of the photos were recent, ones I didn't even remember being in. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not crazy. I know it sounds insane, but I swear, someone has been following me. Watching me. And I think they're watching you too. That's why I came to you. I need to know why." Her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Part of me wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that she had misunderstood. But the evidence was right there in front of me. It wasn't just her. I agreed to take the case, though I had no idea what I was walking into. Over the next few days, I kept a close eye on her. I followed her to her home, keeping a safe distance. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No one tailed her. No strange visitors. Nothing unusual at work. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something in my gut that told me someone was watching me too. The more I looked into it, the more questions I had. Who was the man in the photos? Was someone watching us both? Why me? I even began to search my own life, wondering if there was something I had missed, a connection between me and this woman. But I couldn't find one. I didn't know her. I hadn't seen her before, at least not that I could recall. Then one evening, as I was reviewing the photos in my office, something caught my eye. In one of the pictures, taken at a cafe, I saw him. There was a man sitting at a table behind me. He wasn't in any of the other photos, and I didn't recognize him, but there was something about his stare. His eyes were too intense, too focused, as though he were waiting for me to notice him. Waiting for me to look at him. I didn't tell the woman about the man. I didn't want to alarm her further, but I knew I had to follow this lead. I started visiting the places from the photos, cafes, parks, even the street corner where he'd been standing. But he was always gone before I could get close, as though he knew where I'd be before I did. And that's when the truth hit me. This wasn't about her at all. It was about me. The photos weren't just of her. They were of me. My life, scattered across photographs like someone was tracking my every move. Whoever had been following her had been following me too. Only in a much more subtle, insidious way. I was the target. Not her. The realization crept in slowly, like a cold weight settling over my chest. This wasn't just a case. It wasn't just a mystery. Someone had been watching me for months, maybe longer, and I had no idea why. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, I was already part of the story I was hired to solve. I had been investigating myself all along, unknowingly chasing a shadow that had been lurking just behind me for far too long. And now, I was the one in danger. Story 8. I never imagined I'd end up working at a gas station. It was one of those jobs I took out of desperation, after a series of bad decisions left me scrambling just to make ends meet. The station was tucked away in a small, remote town, miles from anywhere, surrounded by endless stretches of highway and dense, haunting woods. There wasn't much to do, just pump gas, clean up the place, and occasionally chat with a few passing customers. It was peaceful, or at least I thought it would be. The first few weeks passed without incident. I worked the late shift, greeting the occasional trucker or weary traveler who stopped for gas or snacks. But there was one regular, a man who drove an old, beat-up truck that reeked of stale cigarettes and old coffee. He came in every night at the same time, alone, silent. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another creature of habit. But there was something about him, something off, like he was always watching me more than the world around him. He never said much. Just paid for his gas, bought a few lottery tickets, and left. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, lurking in the background. It started small, little things I'd notice when I wasn't looking. No matter what time I arrived or left, he'd be there. His truck parked across the street, waiting. And sometimes, when I looked out the window, I'd see him watching me, his face half hidden in the shadows, his eyes never leaving me. It unsettled me, but I pushed it aside. He was probably just another lonely soul passing through. Things took a strange turn after the third week. The man, still coming in every night, began to linger longer. He'd just sit there, staring, as if he was waiting for something. If I made eye contact, he'd nod, slowly, deliberately, as though we shared some unspoken understanding. But there was no understanding, not between us. And then, one night, everything changed. I was done for the night, about to head home when I noticed his truck parked outside. But he wasn't in it. I hesitated. Maybe he was inside, using the restroom, or taking care of something. But then, I saw it, movement, way off in the distance. A figure, walking slowly toward me. It was him. I froze, a chill creeping down my spine. This wasn't right. The gas station was miles away from any real neighborhood, the highway empty and desolate at night. My heart raced. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I was alone, and he was coming toward me. I started my car and pulled out of the lot, trying to shake the uneasy feeling building inside me. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, his headlights were behind me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, just another traveler on the road. But as the miles stretched on, I realized, he was following me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. I took a turn off the main highway, hoping to lose him. But when I glanced back, there he was, still a few car lengths behind, driving at the same speed, never speeding up, never slowing down. It was as if he was making sure I couldn't escape. My pulse quickened. I took another turn, hoping to lose him, but he mirrored my every move. For 20 minutes, I drove aimlessly, my fear growing with each passing second, knowing something wasn't right. Finally, in a panic, I pulled into a small parking lot, hoping he would just pass by. I cut the engine and held my breath, watching his truck slowly roll past. He didn't stop. He didn't even look at me. He just drove on as if he hadn't been following me at all. But I knew better. The whole thing felt wrong, like he knew exactly where I lived, like he was watching me. The next night, when I arrived for my shift, I saw him again. This time, he was parked outside the gas station, hours before his usual time, sitting in his truck, his face obscured by the darkness, his eyes locked on me. I hesitated. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't have any real proof. No concrete reason to escalate things. But that gut feeling, my instinct, told me it wasn't just my imagination. As the night wore on, the tension between us grew. He came in, as usual, bought his tickets, and left. But this time, I followed him. Discreetly, quietly. I told myself it wasn't wrong, just cautious. I had to know if my suspicions were real. But as I followed him, I realized something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't taking his usual route. He turned down side streets, winding paths that led deep into the woods, miles away from town. The streetlights grew fewer, the roads rougher, and I felt my nerves fray. I was being led somewhere. I could feel it, like a trap closing in around me. My breath caught in my throat as I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. The truck disappeared into the night, leaving me alone in the silence. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, unsure of what to do. Had I imagined it all? When I got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, but the feeling lingered, an unease, a constant prickle on the back of my neck. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. Tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But when I pulled into the gas station parking lot one evening, I saw him again. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I called the police and reported his strange behavior. When they arrived, he was still there, sitting in his truck, those lifeless eyes watching me from the shadows. They spoke with him for a while, and when they came back, they told me the truth. He had a history of stalking people in remote areas. He had been following me for weeks, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I never saw him again after that night. The police said he had been arrested and taken away. But the fear never fully left. Every time I hear a truck engine in the distance or catch a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder, is he out there? Waiting. Story 9. I had been driving for hours, trying to escape the weight of a long week, the hum of the tires on the road my only companion. The road stretched before me like an endless, twisting ribbon, leading me deeper into an unfamiliar countryside. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I was desperate for solitude, for a sense of peace that I thought a long drive would provide. The miles slipped by, but with them came a growing sense of unease. The trees, once scattered along the roadside, now crowded in, their limbs clawing at the edges of the road like skeletal hands reaching out. The air grew thick with fog, choking the life out of everything around me. It felt like the world outside my car was closing in, slowly swallowing me whole. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. A narrow, unmarked road had appeared out of nowhere, barely wide enough for my car. Curiosity, foolish, maybe, nudged me to follow. I thought it would lead me to a main highway or a familiar route. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, the sound eerie in the silence. The trees pressed closer, their branches leaning in like they had a mind of their own, wanting to drag me deeper into the suffocating forest. At first, I told myself it was just a detour, a short, winding path that would eventually loop me back to the main road. But after a few miles, unease crept in. There were no signs, no markers. The road seemed to stretch on forever in one direction, swallowed by the dense trees and thickening fog. My phone had no signal. The usual hum of distant traffic was gone, leaving an unsettling silence. I checked the fuel gauge, relieved to see I had plenty of gas. But my gut told me this wasn't just some random detour. Something was off. The road twisted unnaturally, looping in on itself. No matter which direction I took, I ended up back on the same stretch, as though the road was playing tricks on me. It felt as if the landscape around me was shifting, like I was caught in a place where time didn't follow the rules. I passed the same twisted tree twice, then again a third time, but each time, it felt like I was seeing it for the first time. The sense of déjà vu grew, the tension in my stomach tightening with each turn. The road didn't end. There were no intersections, no signs, just trees, fog, and the silence that weighed heavier with every passing second. I tried counting the turns, hoping to find a pattern, a clue that would lead me out. But hours passed, and I had no idea how many times I had passed that one bend. My mind was unraveling, a mix of exhaustion and growing dread creeping into every thought. I rolled down the window, desperate for some fresh air, but the chill that poured in only intensified the feeling of being trapped. I stopped the car, hoping the stillness would clear my mind. The engine idled in the quiet, broken only by the occasional rustling of the trees. But that's when I noticed it. The creeping realization that I hadn't seen a single other vehicle. No headlights, no signs of life, not even a single tire track on the road. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The world outside my car had become a void, as if I had slipped into some place where no one else existed. I tried again, taking the same route I thought would lead me out. Left, right, left again. Each turn, I hoped to spot something familiar, a road sign, a sign of civilization. But the landscape remained eerily identical, as if frozen in time. The trees, the fog, the silence, nothing had changed. I checked my watch in disbelief. Hours had passed, but it felt like I hadn't moved an inch. Frustration built, panic rising like bile in my throat. How was this possible? I honked the horn, hoping for a response, a sound, anything to break the suffocating loop. But there was nothing. No honk in return, no sign of life. The road had swallowed me whole, and no matter how many times I tried, it refused to let me go. I thought about leaving the car, walking into the fog, but the thought terrified me more than the road itself. I felt, deep down, that if I left the safety of the car, I might never come back. Something about the fog, the silence, it felt like if I stepped out, I would be consumed by it, lost to the void. I tried calling my family, but there was no signal. I felt the weight of isolation, the creeping sensation that time itself had forgotten me. The world outside no longer made sense. I wasn't just lost on a road anymore, I had stumbled into something else, something darker. A place where the usual rules of reality didn't apply. As the hours passed and the fog thickened even further, I lost all sense of time. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen the sun. Had it ever been day? I kept driving, following the endless road, hoping for an end that never came. The idea of being stuck here forever began to feel more real than I was willing to admit. And I realized, no matter how many times I tried, the road would never let me go. I was trapped. Story 10. It all started innocently enough. I'd been feeling uneasy for a while, but it wasn't until the dead of night that the true terror began to settle in. I woke suddenly to the buzz of my phone on the bedside table, the light from the screen cutting through the darkness like a warning. It was a message from an untraceable number, "I see you." My heart slammed into my ribs, cold fear spreading through me like ice. My mind immediately flashed to Adam, my ex. It had been 6 months since we broke up, but I had always known he couldn't let go. I thought this was it, his final, sick push over the edge. The messages kept coming, relentless and cryptic, sometimes laced with aggression. "I'm closer than you think," one said. I couldn't shake the memories of our relationship, the late-night arguments, his obsession with knowing my every move, where I was, who I was with. Adam had always been possessive, but this was different. This felt like something darker, something terrifying. Then there were the calls. Always blocked, always distorted. But the voice. I knew it. The cadence, the way the breath hitched on the other end of the line, there was no mistaking it. It was him. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. I couldn't go anywhere without constantly checking over my shoulder, even inside my own home. I did what anyone would do when they felt hunted. I called the police, filed a report, blocked the number. But still, the calls came. Every day. Sometimes more than once. The messages grew worse, more urgent. "You can't hide from me. I'm always watching. I was sure Adam had found a way to track me, but a small part of me wanted to reach out, to beg him to stop. I knew that would only make it worse, so I forced myself to ignore it. But the anxiety was eating me alive. One night, after a particularly harrowing phone call, I snapped. I checked everything, locks, windows, the perimeter of my house. It was late, and the wind howled outside, but the feeling that someone was out there, hiding just out of sight, was suffocating. I even considered installing cameras, but then I hesitated. What if that only made things worse? I didn't know how far this would go, or what kind of response I might provoke. My mind raced, torn between fear and the desperate need for answers. Then the message came. It buzzed against my phone in the quiet, waking me from a restless sleep. This time, it was different. The message read, "You're not alone at Reed," and attached was a picture, one I hadn't seen before. It was a photo of me, taken from outside my window just hours earlier. I froze, staring at the image, my blood running cold. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. How had anyone taken that photo? My window had been closed, my blinds drawn. I had locked the doors before going to bed, and I hadn't heard a sound in the night. The panic rose up, choking me. For the first time, I wondered, am I being watched right now? I called the police again, desperate, telling them about the photo. They were sympathetic, but skeptical. They advised me to install cameras, change my routine. Their words, though calm, felt dismissive, as though they couldn't fathom the true depth of the terror I was living. But even as I spoke to them, something gnawed at me. A sense that I wasn't the only one in this twisted situation. I scrolled through the messages and calls again, looking for any clue I might have missed. That's when it hit me. A small, almost imperceptible detail, each of the blocked calls, every one of the anonymous messages, had come from my own phone number. The realization slapped me like ice water to the face. My breath caught in my throat. How was that even possible? My phone had been in my hand every time. It couldn't have been hacked. I stared at the screen, disbelieving. My own number was sending me these threatening calls and cryptic messages. I didn't know whether to be relieved or horrified. The stalker wasn't a person, not in the way I had feared. It was something far worse, something intangible. A digital phantom, haunting me. I was consumed by confusion, unsure whether to be angry at technology for betraying me or at myself for not realizing it sooner. The fear didn't fade. It lingered, persistent and suffocating, but at least now I had an explanation, a reason to cling to. For a brief moment, I felt like I was fighting against some glitch in the universe, trying to survive a nightmare I didn't fully understand. But the truth, as I would soon realize, was even worse. I wasn't just being stalked. I was trapped in a place where reality itself was crumbling around me, and no matter what I did, there was no escaping it.